for studying words of Torah, and then we'll let Asaf finally teach. Please join me as we say together, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam, Asher Kidshanu B'mitzvotav, V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Asaf, you're on.
Amen. Toda. Thank you. Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you again. As far as those of you whom I can see, I hope you can all see me. I just want to make sure. Can you see? It's more important than seeing me is seeing the slides. So I think it would be best if you would look at the slides, because I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to use a lot of text, and I will talk about the text. So it's better if you want to look at me, just look at the text. And again, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to see you again. I think I've seen some of you back in the old days of face-to-face classes. It seems to belong to a different era. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of the things I'm really interested in and I'm working on. And so the topic, as you can see, is racial justice, a Jewish matter. The topic was decided quite a while ago. And again, it's something I'm working on and I'm very interested in. Unfortunately, as you all know, it has become, again, very painfully relevant. So the topic was decided way before the recent incidents, but it's probably no coincidence that such things, violence against African-American people, happen again and again. And one of the questions that we want to ask ourselves, I think, as people who are assumedly interested in ethics and interested in Judaism, is how that concerns us. And that might be one way to read the title of the talk, is Racial Justice, a Jewish Matter. And that's pretty much what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the question, is racial justice a Jewish matter? And of course, a simple answer can be, yes, Jews should fight against racism, or a simple answer can be, no, Jews have nothing to do with race. So there might be two possible options. And as Rabbi David said, I'm a philosopher, so I tend to make things complicated. And I want to suggest a philosophical perspective about this question. So my hope is that at the end of the talk, you might be able to get a different perspective on that kind of question. And the perspective that I want us to use is actually a perspective of someone who is not Jewish, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is actually the greatest, the most influential, and I think the most important African-American scholar and activist. I will say a bit more about him and about his life and about his interest in Jewish life and about his interest in that specific question about the connection between racial justice and Jewish life. And when I say the talk is, you see on the title, Du Bois in Jewish life, I speak about the way Jews live. That means part of what Tikkun is about, and I will talk about that too, but also a specific journal called Jewish Life that Du Bois was actually collaborating with. So that's pretty much what I want to do today, and I want to bring it into the context. So the talk it's a bit long. I will try not to expand too much. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. So if you can wait until the end with questions, that's fine. If there is something really urgent, there should be ways to let me know using Zoom. If there is something urgent, I'm happy to stop and expand on any topic. So the question is, before I come to the topic, what's the connection? What's the connection to Tikkun Shavuot? And Tikkun, as Rabbi David was saying, is the command to study the Torah, to study Judaism, to study certain aspects of Judaism on Shavuot night, to study all night. One understanding of that, and the other understanding of Tikkun, literally mending the world. And that's the religious command. If any of you have attended the talk that I gave back in the old day about Kabbalah, and I mentioned the idea of Tikkun Olam, the mending of the world, as a religious command. So divine, the idea is, that's the main idea, it's not, I was talking about Kabbalah, but it's not only in Kabbalah. You can find it in the Bible, you can find it in the Mishnah, you can find it in many aspects in the history of Judaism, that the religious command comes from the understanding that redemption, divine redemption, doesn't come from above. It depends whether God reveals himself to us, whether God redeems us, depends on what we are doing in this world. So that really God depends on human being. God depends on what we are doing. And that's the central meaning of ethics in Judaism. And that's also the central meaning and the importance of thinking of social justice in Judaism. Before we even speak about Jewish history, and I will speak a lot about Jewish history, there is the idea of social justice as part of the understanding of mending or repairing the world. So repairing the damages of this world, almost in a kind of metaphysical sense, but it's very connected to the religious and the ethical sense. Fighting against inequality and discrimination, something that we are commanded to do in a religious sense, and also specifically, and that's what I want to expand on, the idea of racial justice, fighting against racism, the Jewish experience of anti-Semitism and its implications, and against all kinds of discrimination, which raises another question. If I speak about racial justice in Judaism, we may ask, what does race have got to do with Jews? Are Jews, and that's one of the main questions that we may want to ask ourselves. I don't have a ready-made answer to that question. Is Judaism a religion? What is Judaism? So that's part of the question about the relevance of racial justice to Judaism is part of clarifying what Judaism is. Is it a religion, a creed, a culture, an ethnicity, a nation, a race? And there are many discussions about race in Judaism. In America, historically, Jews were considered white or considered themselves to be white or could pass as white. So that's one of the critiques that many African Americans are raising towards Jews. It was easier to pass as white. Is that something that we can take for granted? Are Jews white? Are all the Jews white? And then if we consider Jews as white, are Black, brown, Hispanic Jews, are they racial minority within Judaism? Or are all Jews a race of their own? So that's the kind of questions that are usually being asked when talking about Jews and race, and that's a question that has been discussed quite a lot recently. What I want us to do today is, again, instead of providing a ready-made answer to all these questions, I want to look at some historical discussion, and I want to look at some text, some historical discussion, and some texts that are related to Judaism. And before I will talk about Du Bois, the African-American scholar, and his connection to and his reflections on Judaism, I want us to look at some of the most foundational texts in modern, let's say modern Jewish politics, and also modern Jewish ethics, a text that I'm not sure if any of you have read it. As you might know, I grew up in Israel, and that was kind of a required reading in school. That's the foundational text in modern Zionism, a text that was published by THEODOR HERZL, the visionary. HERZL was pretty much a lawyer and a journalist, and he's considered the visionary of a Jewish state. And he published a book in 1902. It's a novel called Alt Neuland. He published it in German. There are many Yiddish versions of that. So Alt Neuland, or my Yiddish pronunciation is not so great. In English, it was published as Old New Land. It's also interesting that the first translation of the book to Hebrew, and it's very important to everything I will say now, was the translation was Tel Aviv, which became the name of the first big city in Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel, really the name of the city was based on the book. It's a utopian novel which presents the idea of Zionism as a Jewish utopia. And it really describes life in the utopian state of the Jews. It was, again, published in 1902, and it describes, so it's the story, again, it shows the successful state of technological and scientific progress on the one hand, and then social justice and equality for all on the other hand. So it's really the perfect state created by the Jews. Palestinians are hardly mentioned in the book, something to think about. HERZL wasn't really aware of that. And it's the idea of a new Jewish life free of prejudice, oppression, persecution, and violence. It's a problematic book, but I want to focus on one aspect. So again, that's the creation of a very early idea of Zionism, the end. So Zionism means, for that book, the end of oppression of all minorities. And the story tells, so it's a novel about one Jewish intellectual from Vienna who meets another Jewish German aristocrat. The Viennese intellectual comes back to Vienna from America, so he spends some time in the US. He goes, and they go on expedition. So they go on a ship and they want to establish, or they want to kind of escape the depressive European culture, and they want to go on an island in the Pacific Ocean, and they leave in 1899. They make a stop in Palestine, and they see a very backward land, a very undeveloped land, hardly any population and no social, no political system. They spend some time there. They go for 20 years to that Pacific island, and on the way back, 20 years later, 1923, again, the book is from 1902, and it describes the future. In 1923, they go again to Palestine, and they are completely amazed by what they see. They see a completely different land, a completely new, so that's the Zionist utopia, a completely developed technologically and scientifically, but also a land of political emancipation and self-creation of the Jews, again, with equalities for everyone, equality for everyone. I said that doesn't really include Palestinians. So Palestinians are part of the problem, or part of the situation, but they are not really central in the book, and that's one of the critique. But I want to focus on one aspect of the book. So in part, when they go back to Palestine, they meet a doctor. They meet a doctor who spent some time in the US and also came back to Palestine. And he found, you'll be surprised how everything is so relevant. He found the medication that would cure malaria. So that was, I'm not sure if it was hydroxychloroquine, but these questions were even discussed back then. And I think our president may have a lot to learn from the conversation that they had. So he found the cure for malaria for Palestine, for the Jews, but he said it's not enough. He wanted to export the cure for malaria to Africa. He wanted to make Africa the land for all people. And then there started a discussion. So I'm just saying all the details to get into the discussion and show how that kind of discussion is relevant for all I want to say. So the Viennese, the intellectual from Vienna, is saying to the doctor who found the cure to the malaria, and he wanted to make it possible for white people to go to Africa. And he says, you want to cut off the whites to the black continent, you wonder Walker. He says it kind of ironically. And the response of the Jewish Palestinians, so the Jewish doctor from Palestine, is quite interesting. And it's something that, again, nobody really paid attention to when looking at the book. And the book was so influential in creating the state and the Zionist utopia that people don't tend to pay attention to what the doctor says. And he said, no, I do not want to I do not want to just allow the white to go there. I want even the black people to be able to go to Africa. And he says there is still one problem of racial misfortune unsolved. So one problem unsolved after the Jewish problem was solved. And he says, the depth of that problem in all their horror, only a Jew can fathom, only a Jew can understand. And he says, and I'm using the language from the book, the language from that time, I mean the Negro problem. Don't laugh, Mr. King's quote is that the intellectual. Think of the hair-raising horrors of the slave trade. Human beings, because their skins are black, are stolen, carrying off, and sold. Their descendants grow up in alien surroundings, despised and hated because their skin is differently pigmented, he says. I'm not ashamed to say, though I may be thought ridiculous, now that I have lived to see the restoration of the Jews, I should like to pave the way for the restoration of the Negro. So he says basically only Jews can understand the situation and only Jews should be able to solve that. And I'm telling all the story just to point at how that question was, how important was that question for the most fundamental text of modern Jewish politics. But I'm saying that as a kind of excursion on the way to the main story that I want to tell. And it's a kind of a philosophical story and also historical one. I will say a few things about William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, and then I will say about more things about how his thinking and how his work, how relevant it is for Jewish life, for Jewish history, for Jewish ethics, for Jewish philosophy, and how we may be able to receive an answer to the question that I'm very interested in, and I assume that some of you may be interested, is racial justice a Jewish matter? And I think we will get a different answer when we look at that. So he was born in 1868 in Massachusetts, again, as a free man, of course. At the age of 15, he became a writer and reporter so he developed as intellectually at a very young age. He was writing for a newspaper, for a black weekly journal. He was the only African-American who graduated in his class, and he wanted to go to Harvard, but of course, being black and from poor surrounding, it was impossible for him. So he studied at Fisk, at Nashville. That was a historically black college. And then he was accepted to Harvard. And when he studied, I'm saying all the story again to make another point important, he was studying in Harvard. But when he was studying there, again, as one of the very few African-American students, he studied. So after he did his undergraduate studies, he continued for graduate studies, and he traveled to Germany between 1892 and 1894. So he basically traveled a lot in Europe, and he studied 2 years at the University of Berlin, where he experienced not just experienced the growing anti-Semitism, it's also very interesting that he says later on in his biography that living in Berlin as an African-American at that time, everyone assumed that he was Jewish. So speaking about the question whether Jews are race or not, he's telling about a time where he was taking the taxi to go back home, and the taxi driver, without even asking, just drove him to the Jewish quarter, because it was clear that if he's looking back, he must be a Jew, which I think says a lot. And it tells us, for our case, it tells us something about his own interest in Jewish questions. But at that time, he studied in Berlin, he studied sociology and also philosophy and history, but he became a sociologist, and he studied under the greatest minds of the time in Berlin. All of them were, or most of them were, some of the greatest anti-Semites. He was really studying the most advanced anti-Semitic theories. It will be relevant for us in a minute. He came back and he became the first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard. He became a professor at Atlanta University, and he started to do, so he pretty much imported much of what he learned in Germany about the new sociology. That means going to the places, observing the life of the people, the life of minorities. So he was the first one who started doing social studies about life in rural Georgia outside Atlanta, what was called the Black Belt. I think he was going and talking to people, and his research was really influenced by what he experienced and what he saw at the time. It was also influenced by his own experiences, his private personal experience when his first son was born. He died when he was just 18 months, very young, and it was a tragedy. Again, something that, of course, happened much more often to Black people. Unsurprisingly, that not so much has changed since. So that's one thing that affected him. And another was, so he was a young professor who was also politically involved. And that was the time of the case of Sam Hose, a poor Black young man who was accused of, who got into an argument with his employer. He was accused of murdering him. He was put to trial, and Du Bois was involved in a sense of going to the court and providing the documentation and collecting witnesses and bringing all the documentation needed to make sure that he would face a fair trial. But before the trial, the boy was just taken by a white mob, was lynched and hanged. And I didn't want to put the photos on the PowerPoint, but the photos of this lynching and hanging by the mob before trial are still available and accessible. And if you watch CNN today, I think you would see similar pictures. So I just want to say something about how relevant that all is. In 1903, he published his first book. That's the book that made him famous, and that's the book that I will talk a bit more about in a minute, The Souls of Black Folk. The soul. So the book focuses on the inner life, on the individual personal experience of Black people, how racism and discrimination affects the soul, psychologically. So not just the external perspective, the way white people see Black people, and again, but the way Black people see themselves from the inside. And there are, I think, we might be able to see some similarities to the Jewish experience. I will say more about that in a minute. In 1909, he joined the National NEGRO Committee, so that was kind of the General Association for Black People, which became a year later, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I should say that he was the only Black person who was a member of the association. It consisted only of white people, except for Du Bois when it was established. But then in 1936, so that's another anecdote that's relevant and will become relevant for what I will say later. In 1936, he travels again as a professor to Europe, to Russia, China, Japan, and then he spends 5 months in Germany, right after the rise of Nazism, and he was really astounded by what he saw. And we will all look at some of the text that he wrote during that time. In the 1950s, so he came back to the US, and he was suspected of being a foreign agent. He declined to declare that he's not a member of the Communist Party, and he was, again, as one of the leading sociologists, one of the most important professors in America. He was indicted, fingerprinted, handcuffed, and released on bails. He was taken by the FBI at the time, and he pretty much gave up. He gave up so he was invited to Ghana to do academic work on the Encyclopedia Africana. And he stayed in Ghana, he became a citizen, and he died there in 1963, completely disappointed, completely embittered and pessimistic about the struggle for racial justice in the US. And it's quite interesting that the day he died was one day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." So it was the day after Du Bois, who started the fight, or who advanced the fight, died, very pessimistic, and it just raises many questions about what happened since. So now I want us to look at some of his texts, and I provided some background so we can kind of locate the argument to get a context of Du Bois as a person, Du Bois as a scholar, and Du Bois's own experiences, both as an African American and as someone who had some experience of discrimination against Jews and persecution. In 1903, the beginning of the 20th century, he says, so that's one of the most kind of general sentences in the beginning of the book, the problem of the 20th century, and it was the beginning of the 20th century, is the problem of the color line. So race discrimination, that will be the problem of the 20th century. Again, we may ask where we are standing now. And he was famous for introducing a concept that should help us get a better sense of, again, the soul, the internal life of African American. And I think, again, I'm suggesting it as something to think about, that might be relevant also for, at least to some aspects of the Jewish experience, the idea of a double consciousness. I will read. And he says, the Negro is a sort of a seventh son, born with a veil. So something kind of separates between the person and the world of the others, white people, gifted with a second sight in this American world. So being able to see everything twice. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. That means seeing oneself the way one perceives oneself, but also seeing oneself the way one is perceived by the other. When I read that, I thought it says a lot about the Jewish experience, kind of, I wouldn't go all the way saying living a double life, but seeing things twice. And he says it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. That was, again, something that I think many Jews, I can't judge how much of it is relevant for Jewish life in America today, but I think throughout the centuries, from the Middle Ages and before, I think many Jews would be able to identify with that. But again, I don't want to take that to be a Jewish sentence. That's his description about the psychology of African American life. And the interesting thing that he's doing in the book, again, so that was the idea of the double consciousness, but he actually goes to rural Georgia, to places where 80% of the population was Black. And he said there's a lot of discussion who the book was written for, but it's very likely was written for white people. And he writes to the white people, if you wish to ride with me, if you want to go on the trip with me and see what life under racism, racial discrimination is, you must come into the Jim Crow car. So that was the train car that was reserved. That was the only train car that Black African American were allowed to use. Whites could use it, but could also use other cars. So you must come into, because you can only, that means that you can only see discrimination if you see from the eyes of people who are suffering racism. And so he says, come with me and see it through my eyes. And he goes, and that's another interesting point of how relevant that is, not just the idea of hydroxychloroquine, but also the idea of traveling at the end of the 19th century. So the book was published in 1903, but it describes the life at the turn of the century in Dougherty County, Georgia. So he goes to Albany, the capital of, or the big city of Dougherty County, Georgia. I assume that many of you have come across the place recently. So that's the place where the recent health crisis was at its most disturbing. There was still a place of poverty, and the interesting point is that even though 80%, even more of the population were Black, so it seems like people could live among themselves a life free of racism. And he was really pointed at how deep inside the mental life racism can go, even though there were hardly any white people around. And what he shows in the book is that even in post-Civil War, in seemingly post-emancipation America, after the abolition of slavery, there were life of kind of semi-slavery, extreme poverty. Most people were earning no more or even under what was necessary for their surviving. On the one hand, so extreme poverty, living kind of far away from others, but then most of the black people were living in conditions of poverty. Racism came down or was reaching well down into the soul, but at the same time they were living a life of relative peace and security, he finds, free from violence, so far away from white Americans, far away from the slaveholders. And then he mentions the fact, and nobody could prove whether that's right or wrong, but in the book he says there was always a substantial Jewish presence in Dorothy County. There were many Jews living there. So on the one hand, and that's where things become complicated, because there were many Jews, and Jews pretty much inherited the white Americans either moved away or were just not any more powerful after the end of slavery. So Jews were at least, I mean, were not the majorities, but there were many Jews at the time, and that might be a reason for the fact that that Black people could live in life of peace and security. We may want to think what it means, but still extreme poverty. And this is complicated because in the book itself, when I say, so the African Americans could live, so they could not live a life free from discrimination by themselves. They needed someone else to replace the white Americans, so they needed the Jews. But at the same time, he says, the Jews, and there are many quotations that I have here from the book, he says basically Jews inherited, says, the slave barons in Dorothy County. And some of the things that he says in the text itself may seem extremely anti-Semitic. And I said that he was studying under the greatest anti-Semitic German minds, and he might have taken with him at that time some of the prejudices about Jews. Again, exploitation. There's the plantation is owned by a Russian Jew. After the war, it was for many years worked by gangs of Negro convict, but then they took the convict from the plantations, which have been ruined, and then when ravished into a red waste, out of which only a Yankee or a Jew could squeeze more blood from the debt-cursed tenants. So Yankees, but he focuses here also in other parts of the text on Jews who are kind of exploiting Black people, poor Black people. I'm going to read other quotations that are quite disturbing, but I will say something about that in a minute, so it's going to change. It has passed to those who have come to take charge of the industrial exploitation of the New South, the sons of poor white fired with a new thirst for wealth and power, and also he speaks of shrewd and unscrupulous Jews. So again, Jews, and he says here also later on, speaks about Russian Jews who, he speaks about Russian Jews who came there and kind of replaced the slaveholder, making sure that Black people could live in relative safety, but still exploiting them. Now, so that was the book, kind of, I'm not sure if I would say being thankful for the Jews, but mostly accusing them for exploiting, maintaining kind of slavery. That's what he says in 1903. So there are many passages in the book that are accusing the Jews that in things that, and at some point he said, I couldn't have known that. It might not even been a fact. Nobody really knows if they were actually Jews, or he might have, and now I'm going to the 50th anniversary edition of the same book, just to see what he says about that, and that's going to be, again, very important for the argument I'm making. The same book was published 50 years later in a new edition, and in the new edition, I'm going to write, so he pretty much removed all references to Jews, because he said, that might be wrong, and it's even more than that. And he said, he adds at the end of the book, as I read the passages again, in the light of subsequent history, again, 53, think of what happened by that time, he was traveling to Europe, he was aware of the Holocaust and everything that happened since, and that made him rethink his descriptions of Jews, rethink his own prejudice. And he says, in the light of subsequent history, I see how I laid myself open to this possible misapprehension. What, of course, I meant to condemn was the exploitation of black labor, and that it was in this country and at that time, in part, a matter of immigrant Jews was incidental and not essential. So the fact that these were Jews doesn't say anything about Jews, he says. But again, he wanted to emphasize the fact that even Jews who came from other places were not, most of them were not even born there. They kind of inherited economically they bought the plantation because they were considered white. They were able to maintain this kind of race distinction. So he said it might be just an incident or incident that these were Jews, nothing that doesn't say anything essential about Jews. And he adds, this illustrates how easily one slips into unconscious condemnation of a whole group. So he basically retracted, he changed his text in the book. He removed all references to Jews. To make things even more complicated, he replaced all reference to Jews. Instead of Jews, he said immigrants, foreigners. That sounds extremely problematic from today's view. So those immigrants who came to America kind of continued the tradition of slaveholders and of exploitation, but it doesn't speak anymore about racism. So again, I'm not going to say that it's better because it's very problematic. I mean, the whole use of immigrants and foreigners, but think of the time, it was 53. In 53, the experience of, again, Black people, that anyone who can come to America can inherit their superiority as long as they are not Black. So it's just a very complex situation, and that's what I want us to be aware of, and see the difficulties in the question. So he changed, he removed, he kind of apologized for that. He learned something. He learned something about, again, how easily one slips into racism, unconscious condemnation of a whole group. But then in those years, and now I'm going to kind of focus more on how Du Bois was increasingly interested in Judaism, in Jewish life, in Jewish ethics, for his own purposes, for the purpose of creating racial equality, for fighting racial injustice, for questions of racial justice. In 1910, he established a journal called The Crisis Record of the Darker Races, and it's still being published, but he's the founding editor, and so it was, again, a journal that was meant to, today we would say, to empower Black people, to give them the tools to struggle to fight against racism, racial injustice. And he says, so the object of this publication, so that was in the first issue of the journal, is to set forth those facts and arguments which show the danger of race prejudice, particularly as manifested today toward colored people. So that's the plan of the book. And it's interesting that throughout the book, so for example, that's just an anecdote before we'll come to the next argument, he recommends books that African Americans should read. And when we look at those, when we look at the reading recommendation, there is The History of the Jews of a Study of Race and Environment, The Martyrdom of the Russian Jews. So he really recommends his readers, mostly African American readers, to read about Jewish history. But that's, again, so that was just another anecdote. In 1922, so another point that I want to make, he speaks again about the connections between the experiences of African Americans and Jews in America. And he speaks about, for example, about education. So he really wants to expose the racism that's under the surface, the racism that people don't talk about. And he says, even if Jews pass as white, even if Jews consider themselves white, other people do not. And again, the kind of, I don't want to rush and say the necessary solidarity, but the relation between the experience was very important to him. And he speaks about, so there was a lot of talk about complaints about crowding of institutions and the desirability of sifting students. And he says the real fear behind all of this is that we are over-educating the masses. So the danger of that people who are not supposed to receive good education, that means who are not white Christian Americans, would get that education. And he says these masses include many groups, but especially two easily distinguished groups, Jews and Negroes, he says, and he gives some examples. I'm happy to share the text with you if you're interested, if you want to look at all these details, but it's really interesting that at some point at Yale, for example, someone says, we do not want Jews or Negroes or Chinamen, we want Americans. So he really points at this kind of discrimination that unites minorities, and he says an action should be made together. But then he says, well, if there is such discrimination at universities in terms of education against Blacks and Jews equally, he says, and that's at the bottom of the page, this attitude strikes the Negro as curiously paradoxical. Black people were considered, I mean, the prejudice was there, they lack brains and they come from low culture, but Jews are coming from kind of educated backgrounds. How can there be such discrimination against Jews? And he explains that, and that's really interesting. He explained that in this kind of subterranean or kind of anti-Semitism that is under the surface. It's a continuation, he says, of European anti-Semitism. So he really, the point is that in order to understand the situation of African Americans, in order to understand the discrimination under the surface, the one that people wouldn't really talk about, right? They would talk about the crowding of universities, the fear of educating the masses, but basically it was not about the masses. It was about specific masses. It was about the ways of specific masses. And he says that's that's why he thought again that African Americans should learn a lot from the history of anti-Semitism. And he says what we see is a combination of religious, racial, and economic hatred. And it's also interesting that so he was really interested in the different experience that German Jews had, those who were accepted to universities, and more than that, he was interested in the experience of Jews who came from Eastern Europe. And it's kind of striking that the way he describes Eastern European Jews is almost using the vocabulary that Black people would describe themselves. He says, then came the Jew from Eastern Europe, born in oppression and born fighting. The new Jew refused to forget his blood, his religion, and his racial consciousness. I'm not sure if many Eastern European Jews would speak about their racial consciousness, but it's interesting that Du Bois finds something in that kind of Jewish experience that could make relevant and meaningful for African American. Even more than that, in 1919, he speaks about, so he was interested in Zionism, again, long before the establishment of the State of Israel. And he talks about, he's interested in, so he was part of the movement, the Africa movement, the movement of kind of Africa for African, kind of redemption for rescue from conditions of post-slavery, and focusing on Africa, on African culture as something that unites and something that gives tools for self-creation and tools for emancipation, not just in the political, but also in the psychological sense. And he speaks about it, again, the idea of establishing a form of government which will be based on the concept that Africa is for African, that there would be a chance for the colored American to emigrate and to go as a pioneer. Pioneer was one of the most important words in Zionist ideas, the pioneering, going and recreating the state. Go as a pioneer to a country which must, sentimentally at least, possess for him some fascination. But it says, and that's another important thing, it is absurd to talk of a return to Africa merely because that was our home 300 years ago, as it would be to expect the members of the Caucasian race to return to the Caucasus. So it's not about the practical, it's not about emigrating there, and that's connected to the idea of Zionism. It's not about practically going to the land, but he wants to say the African movement means to us, again, to us African American, what the Zionist movement must mean to the Jews. The centralization of the race effort and the recognition of a racial found. I would even translate it as kind of as a cultural idea. People do not need to go to that place. So it's not such a political idea in a sense of creating a Zionist state, but it's the idea of something kind of a point of orientation, something to focus on, something that strengthens the self-value, the self-worth. So again, the idea of Africa as something that empowers the same way that Zionism can empower Jews without even going to the land. So something more emotional. That was his idea. He was really drawing from that experience. In 1948, he was really, so that was 2 days after the establishment of the State of Israel and the start of attacks and the war. And he was really, and he was really defending the State of Israel, or not so much defending the State of Israel, but defending the rights of Jews for self-definition. And he really, and that's a text that he wrote. So the Chicago Star was a kind of a socialist journal, mostly. So I think it wasn't necessarily a Jewish newspaper, but most of the people who worked for that paper were, by chance, Jewish socialists. Says now it happens that the Jew wandering through Europe has for 1,000 years been fighting for a place, and he really supports, so he supports that the idea that Jews should be defended in their rights of having a place. He says there is no question of the contribution which Jews made to modern civilization, not only in banking and finance, again taking some prejudice, but in the arts and so on. And he says, should he lose himself in the surrounding population and through that give up his peculiar culture and religion? So again, maintaining one's own culture and religion, that's what he thought was important for Jews and apparently blacks equally. Should he keep to himself an integral unit, or should he try to found a state of his own? So he was supporting against the idea of self-determination. That was very important for him. But that was, again, way before Israel became what it is today. He was really supporting this kind of right of self-determination. 1949, the year after, so he became even more interested in Jewish life. In 1949, he traveled again to Europe, and he went to see what was left of the Warsaw Ghetto. And what he saw there was crucial for him, again, for understanding the African American situation. So that was a really crucial experience for him, not just for educating himself about the situation of the Jews, but for understanding what racism is about. And he says, I have already seen something of his thought before he came to Warsaw. I have seen something of the human upheaval in this world, the scream and shouts of a race riot in Atlanta, and the marching of the Ku Klux Klan. So he thought he'd seen the most terrible things, the threat of courts and police, the neglect and destructions of human habitation. But nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw in 1949. The problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer in my mind a separate and unique thing as I had so long conceived it. It was not even a matter of color and physical and racial characteristic. It was not merely a matter of religion. Do I see some questions in the chat?
Asaf, you probably want to kind of give maybe 2 minutes. We're like in the last 5 minutes now.
Yeah, I'm coming to a close. I probably need 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, but did I miss something else in the chat? I'm not sure.
No, you're good.
Yeah, okay. So I'm coming to a conclusion in a minute, and then I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry that it was a bit longer and more dense than I was hoping. So that's pretty much the final thing that I want us to think about. Again, how Du Bois's own experience of Jewish life and history affected his thinking. And he says, the race problem I was interested in cut across lines of color and physique and belief and status, and was a matter of cultural patterns, perverted teaching and human hate and prejudice, which reached all sorts of people and caused endless evil to all men. So he finds the uniting aspects of racism, so that the ghetto of Warsaw helped me to emerge from a certain social provincialism into a broader conception of what the fight against racial segregation, religious discrimination, and the oppression by wealth had to become if civilization was going to triumph and broaden in the world. So he was learning from the Jewish experience, and so the point is, again, he was learning from the Jewish experience and making kind of Jewish life an aspect of racial justice. So I think the question, when we see it from Du Bois' perspective, we can perceive ourselves differently, and I think we gain a different dimension to the question. It's not just a question of yes or no, but Jewish life and Jewish ethics mean something very practical in this country, and I think in these days. And we can see also the final, or one of the photos that I have here is Martin Luther King, along with Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the leading Jewish philosophers and rabbi who marched alongside Martin Luther King at the march from Selma to Montgomery, the March for Civil Rights. And that's, again, the question, the historical involvement in the civil rights movement and what it means. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions either now or you feel free to email me. Many of the questions that I talk about will also be discussed in the class that I'm teaching this coming fall. So that's kind of the first, I think it's the first ever introduction to Jewish cultures at the University of Louisville. We just got it approved as a general education class. It will probably be taught both in class and online. We need to see, but everyone is welcome to join. I mean, we're happy to have as many students and auditors. So if you're interested in any of the questions, I will talk and continue talking about the questions that I talked about today, and I will extend beyond that. So again, everyone is welcome to join and attend and email me, but I will stop here and let you ask questions, give your comments, observations, or Rabbi David, if you want to say something.
Anybody has a question? You need to unmute yourself if you have a question. Or you can raise your hands and Benji can unmute you. Okay,
I don't have a question, but I wanted to say that it's certainly, to Professor Angermann, that he has really shed a lot of light on the life of Du Bois, which I think is, and I know a lot about Du Bois, but this perspective I didn't.
Thank you. Yeah, many people don't know these aspects, and I thought they're important, not just historically. My feeling is that they mean something. We can learn something.
Mm.
So I see him as doing some kind of Jewish philosophy. So you don't need to be kind of racially Jew, but matter of experience. But that's just my view.
Okay, thank you very much, Asaf. That was wonderful. Thank you. And We had some technical issues in the beginning, but thank you very much for a wonderful evening. What I suggest now is we'll take a 3 to 4 minutes break so people can get another piece of cheesecake to be there before we move to the next class. So if you are up to another hour of studying, then 3 to 4 minutes of restroom cheesecake break, and then we're up to study a little bit biblical texts and Talmudic texts together. So I'm going to get in, and we're going to do some texts from the Torah and mainly texts from rabbinical period. We're going to do one Midrash and one Talmudic texts, not that many texts, and we're going to deal with a few issues. One is, how did Shavuot become Chag Matan Torah, the holiday of the giving and receiving of the Torah? And two, when we say Torah, what do we mean? What do we mean by the giving and receiving of the Torah? What is the Torah that we got? Now, we could have done, or we can do, a 5 years course just on these two subjects, because there's a lot of questions and very few answers. Actually, we're going to do the Jewish thing, and that is upgrade the question without answering the question. We will just touch on them. We will do a touch and run, okay, like a hit and run on the text. So I just want to say, Shavuot, the holiday of weeks, in recent years became a holiday where you study Torah. Some even study Torah all night. There was even an inner joke in a movie called Footnote, a wonderful Israeli movie making fun of people like Asaf on that make a living of footnotes of the academia, about a person that the joke on him that on Shavuot he teaches at 4 different places in the same time. By the way, now it's possible with the Zoom, you could be at 4 different places in the same time, but they're talking about literally teaching at 4 different places in the same time. So the study of Torah became the big thing of Shavuot, and the idea that Shavuot is about is the holiday where we received the Torah and we accepted the Torah is a pretty ancient idea. Having said that, it does not appear in the Torah, it does not appear in the Bible. So my only way to prove it is if we would literally sit here all night, and we'll begin in Genesis and end with the end of Chronicles, and we would go verse by verse, and I would prove to you that nowhere in the Torah and nowhere in the Bible it says that Shavuot is about the giving and receiving of the Torah. But when you look at the liturgy, when we will read tomorrow during service, or when Rabbi Rapport led the Shavuot service tonight, it says in the liturgy, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time that we received our Torah. So it doesn't answer the question, what is the Torah? What Torah did we receive? But it does say that this is the time that we received the Torah. So we're now on the 6th day of the month of Sivan, the Hebrew month of Sivan. So according to the rabbis, that's the date that we stood in Sinai and received the Torah, whatever the Torah was. And we would look at that question. Having said that, if we compare it to another holiday, another pilgrimage holiday, the holiday of Passover, where, you know, we use the same prayer book for all 3 pilgrimage holidays, Sukkot, Shavuot, and Passover. So in Passover, it says, Zman Cheruteinu, the time of our freedom. So it refers to the fact that we were freed from Egypt. So let's see where they got the idea about Passover, and hopefully you'll believe me without reading the entire Bible, but if not, after we're done, you can stay up all night, and if you find it, please, I promise you I'll publish it as the headline of the temple. The rabbi was wrong. We found in the Torah that we actually received the Torah on Shavuot. If you'll find it, will be really breaking news. So let's see how is Passover described. So I'm going to ask Benji to share the text. If we look at Deuteronomy 15, verse 3, let's see what do we celebrate in Passover according to Deuteronomy. Benji, are they all unmuted? Can I just pick someone to read?
They're all muted right now, but I can unmute everybody.
Okay. So Jenny, would you agree to read to us the first verse? Can I pick on you, Jenny?
Sure. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter you shall eat unleavened bread, bread of distress. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly.
Yes.
There's more.
Yeah, but she froze.
Oh.
There's Zoom problem there.
So keep on going.
So why don't you continue, Rabbi David?
Jenny, you froze. Can you
Not actually
continue? Can
flowing.
you read from so that you may remember?
So that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live.
So why do we celebrate Passover according to Deuteronomy? Please just unmute yourself if you want to answer or raise your hand. We're not going to use the chat or anything like that. We're a small enough group. What do we celebrate in Passover according to Deuteronomy 15:3?
The Exodus.
The Exodus from Egypt, the holiday of freedom. So obviously it's in the Torah. It's not a made-up thing by the rabbis. So hopefully you believe me that there is nothing similar about the holiday of Shavuot. Now I mentioned that the holiday of Shavuot, the holiday of weeks, is on the 6th day of Sivan. Now we need a date in order to say that's the date that we received the Torah, right? So let's see if we have that date in the Torah. Let's see, according to Deuteronomy, what's the date of Shavuot, and let's ask ourselves, what's the problem with this date? Okay, gentlemen, and ladies, we do have a problem here. Bonnie, would you unmute yourself and read Deuteronomy 16, please?
You shall count off 7 weeks. Start to count the 7 weeks when the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then you shall observe the Feast of Weeks for the Lord your God, offering your free will contribution according as the Lord your God has blessed you.
So what's the date for Shavuot according to Deuteronomy?
7 weeks.
It's
7
7
weeks.
weeks from starting from harvesting I think it's harvesting. Yeah, harvesting the grain, which might be today or tomorrow or the next day or next week.
Thank you. Who said that?
I did, Carol.
Carol, thank you. It's not only that, Carol, it's even more complicated.
Oh,
One of the beauties of the land of Israel, and I am serious about it, it's really a beautiful thing, is we joke that you don't get bored in Kentucky when it comes to weather, okay? In the morning you have rain, in the afternoon you have snow, and in the evening you have, I don't know what, I mean, it keeps changing.
yeah.
In Israel, it's not like that, but there's big variation between different places in Israel. So if I live in the Negev desert, the time that the sickle is first put to the standing grain is probably a few weeks earlier than if I live in the Galilee. Definitely if I live in the Golan Heights, which is the coldest part there. So there's no actual date for Shavuot. Shavuot is not only an agricultural day, that the date in the Torah is based on the season, the way the season is going, whether it's a drought or it's a rainy season. This year has been the best year considering rain in Israel. For the first time in Israel's history, in like almost 50 years, they actually had to lift up and let some water go out of the Kinneret. They were afraid of floods. We always are afraid of floods here, but in Israel, usually that's not the issue. But that's not normal. So the date of Shavuot would have been a different date. How can you say that an historical event happened in the day of a holiday that doesn't have a date? Okay. If there's no remarks, complaint, or anything, we're going to move to a new question, and that is, what is the Torah that we get there? And I want to say something about it. Can you take the text off for 2 minutes so I can see people, and then I will go back to the text? Thank you. So I want to say something about the Torah, something that we all know. How many times a week do we read the Torah?
3.
Actually,
3
4. Monday morning, Thursday morning, Saturday morning, and Saturday afternoon. But it's okay to say 3 because Saturday afternoon is maybe give or take 15 or 1600 years. It's a new custom. So you might have not heard about it. You only heard about the first 3, about Monday and Thursday and Saturday morning. Now, as you all know, before we were praying in synagogues, we were meeting. Actually, the Hebrew word for a synagogue is a bet knesset, is a house of gathering. We were meeting in order to read the Torah.
That's right.
And one can say that Jewish culture and Jewish texts evolved around reading the Torah. So reading the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, is a huge thing. That's how Jewish culture and Jewish reading and Jewish interpretation, and Asaf wouldn't have a job without reading the Torah. Jewish philosophy is around that. So that is a huge thing for us. And if you look at that calendar, Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, and that's not the reason why those days were picked. But if you look at it, one of the beautiful things in it is that you do not pass 3 days without reading and studying Torah, okay? The idea is that you won't have 3 days that you're not discussing some words of Torah. But what is the Torah? And what were we given in Mount Sinai? So I'm going to start with the classic text that we say to our children when they become a bat or a bar mitzvah. We say it in every synagogue. We didn't invent it here. As we pass the Torah from one generation to another, that's the Sunday school question, answer, which is, by the way, a political answer. It's definitely not the truth, okay? Fake news was not created in the 21st century. We have fake news already in the Mishnah, in Avot, a very early Mishnah, maybe even from the 1st century CE, and a very political one. We're not going to go into the politics. If you look at the Mishnah, if you read it, you will see who is mentioned and mainly who is not mentioned. Okay, there's only one party that is mentioned here. We're skipping about the other party in there. But if you look at it carefully, what is the Torah that was transmitted from Sinai, from generation to another? What is the Torah that we received in Sinai according to this? Is there a volunteer to read, or should I continue to pick people? Please, Sonia.
Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence round the Torah.
So, by the way, it doesn't end here. There's a whole chapter of everyone that received it, skipping those who we don't want to mention that are not from our political affiliation, more or less. And each one adds something. And we have hundreds of years of passing the Torah from one generation to another. So what is the Torah that we received in Mount Sinai according to this classical text that we tell in the synagogue at every bat and bar mitzvah when we invite the student to become part of the community?
What do you mean?
Is that the 5 books of Moses? Is that the 2 tablets of covenant? Is that just part of the 5 books of Moses? According to this Mishnah, what did we get on Sinai? It says Moses received the Torah in Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Now, we don't have a bracket. There is no footnote that says the Torah, i.e. the 5 books of Moses.
No.
The Torah, i.e. the 2 tablets of covenant. But what does it seem to be the Torah? Is that the 5 books of Moses? Does that make sense?
It's saying whatever you're getting today is what was gotten back then.
Be patient.
That's an interesting notion, Holly, there, and maybe it is. It's what's passed from one generation to another. Anybody else wants to be courageous? Yes, Benji. So Benji is suggesting, maybe he looked at my notes, because that's what my note says, that this is actually a very radical text, because it skips, by the way, Ezra is not mentioned there, which is a very interesting thing, that Ezra, the priest, is not mentioned here. But the minute that you say the priest, that means that he's not going to be mentioned there. When I said a political Mishnah, no priest is mentioned there. Aaron is not mentioned there either. But Ezra, who is the person who is the first person to read the Torah publicly, is not mentioned there. Ezra, who is probably the person that headed the editing of the 5 books of Moses, of the Torah, or at least was part of it, because he publishes it later on, he's not mentioned there. That's outrageous, by the way, that he's not mentioned there, that he's jumped on, but no priest, no Kohen is mentioned there, and there's no book that seems to be passed on. So it almost seems that either the oral Torah or maybe everything, including the oral Torah, or as Ali is going to put it, maybe she read ahead the text that we're going to study in a few moments, everything maybe is there. So I'm going to ask a question, assuming something. Is it possible that we received in Sinai the 5 books of Moses?
No, that would be a problem.
Only 4.
What would be the problem, Rayma?
It would be a prophet. Who would know what's going to happen after all those generations, and in the books of the prophets and all the Psalms, it wasn't known.
So our tradition says, and actually Rashi says, that we received everything, all the 5 books of Moses, but that doesn't make any sense, as Rayma said, because we're receiving Moses goes up to the top of Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. If he would have received all 5 books of Moses, he would read ahead about the problem with the scouts, or about hitting the rock that got him banned from the land of Israel. And probably he wouldn't hit the rock after reading that. So probably it doesn't make any sense that we got everything there. Probably we got the 2 tablets of covenant. Who knows? We're going to skip that question. We're going to leave it to Asaf to teach his students when he teaches about the culture, Jewish culture. And since I don't have 4 years, I only have 1 hour, even less than an hour. I want to go to something else, and that is who was present, and then I'll go back to what was in the Torah. So we have a beautiful midrash, one of my favorite midrashim from Shmot Rabbah, from Exodus Rabbah, and it asks who was there. It's actually a very radical midrash, almost an extremely radical midrash. So as we read it, let's ask ourselves, first, the first question, according to this midrash, what's the difference between men and women? Okay, no offense, I see that there's a majority of women here, and I'm getting into a minefield here. And Bonnie took off the picture, and now she's here to get me. So what's the difference between men and women according to this midrash? And my other question is, what kind of a world vis-a-vis our relationship with God does this midrash describes? It actually describes two different kinds of worlds, two different kinds of situation. Susan Waterman, are you up to reading? Do you have, would you be our reader?
I would be happy to read.
Thank you.
So you shall say to the house of Jacob, these are the women. God said to Moshe, speak to them of the general matters, literally heads of things, that they are able to hear. And tell to the children of Israel, these are the men. God said to Moshe, say to them particulars of things that they are able to hear. Another explanation.
Okay, so before we go to the second explanation, which is really the radical one, the first explanation says they're taking the verse from Exodus 19, verse 3, that has a repetition, a poetic repetition, as we sometimes see in poetic things, and it says, "Ko tomar," so you shall say to Bet Yaakov, "Ko tagid livnei Israel," and so shall you say to the children of Israel. And it means actually in the original verse the same thing. That the children of Israel and the children of, or the house of Jacob, that's the same thing. The children of Jacob is also called Israel, so it's the same thing. But the rabbi here in the Midrash says actually the house of Jacob, that means the woman. And the children of Israel, that means the men. And according to this Midrash, how lovely that Darshan, if he was here, he would really be happy that we're on Zoom and not live with everyone that is here in the class. What does the Darshan, the rabbi here sees as the difference between men and women, between female and males?
Men are
When Moses comes to bring the Torah to the people of Israel, how should Moses speak to women and how should he speak to men, according to this midrash?
They are able to hear.
Well, the women are going to teach the children.
But
So-
he's on, go on.
Please, no, you go.
Go on, Sonia.
That's all I wanted to say. The women are
Oh.
going to teach the children, so they're teaching the women first.
Well, that, yes, but it has them only teaching right, but it only teaching of the general matters and saving all the particulars, which suits me fine if they do it this way, that they are able to hear to the men.
So what is actually saying that very nice rabbi with great observance of the differences between males and females? He says there's an intellectual differences between female and male. So women, just give them the headlines, the simple things. Don't bother them with the details. That would be too much for them to handle. The men, you can actually give the details. He said that, and now he's home with his wife and he's in trouble, so he's shushed. And now we're going to the next darshan, to the next rabbi after him. But the first one just says, you have to teach everyone according to their level. So everyone was there, male and female, but the females just give them the headlines. The details, only the male will understand. Now we're going to have what Susan was already saying. Where is it? In the, another explanation. Okay, please.
Another explanation. Why were the women first? Since they are keen with mitzvot. Another explanation, so that they could accustom their children to Torah.
So what are the reasons here? We're not yet with the radical one yet. Now we're getting there, but we have two other rabbis. One says, why women first?
They're eager.
Yes, they're more pious. If there's a mitzvah, the women run to do the mitzvot. the men, they take it easy. They're less pious than the women. And the other person says, why women?
So that they
Teach
can
the
teach
children.
children.
Yes, they are homeschooling their children, so it's more important that they would hear first, okay? So the first rabbi, probably if we were back to in-person studying, wouldn't make it out alive from our Torah study class. But the second two would be okay, right? Because it's complementing women vis-a-vis men. Now comes the real radical explanation. Rabbi Tachlifa de Kasrin, I'm saving you the big name.
So glad you did that.
So you know what? Let's just read his name and we'll ask, where is he from and why is that important for us to know? Okay.
So Rabbi Tachlifa de Kasrin, Kingmaker.
So where is he from?
I don't know.
You actually been there, Susan. You were there with me, so I know that you were there.
Okay.
Other Susan, you are also there. Keisarin, how does that sound? What city?
Caesarea.
Caesarea, thank you.
Oh.
Who jumped with Caesarea? Karen.
Not
Okay.
until you repeated it.
So were you.
Okay, Caesarea, Caesarea. Anybody who's been to Israel remembers what, by any chance, what is special about Caesarea, Kesarin? Who built it?
The Romans.
The Romans.
No,
Actually, not the Romans.
Herod built it to honor the Romans.
Who built it?
Herod, I
Herod,
think. one
King
of them.
Herod, yes.
Yeah.
Not the Herod from Herod's Creek in Prospect, but King Herod. So, what do we know about Caesarea? It's a port city, and it's a Roman Jewish city. So we have someone who comes from a mixed city that is, you could say, a Judea-Greek city, where he probably also learned philosophy, probably also was influenced. So you already know quite a lot about the background of that person. And now let's see the reason that he brings. This is really a radical text. Please, Susan.
Said the Holy One, Blessed One, when I created the world, I commanded only the first man. And after that, Chava was commanded, and she transgressed and corrupted the world. Now, if I do not call the women first, they will nullify the Torah. So it says, so say to the house of Jacob.
Okay, so what's the reason according to Rabbi Tachlifa from Caesarea?
That
The men are going to mess it up. They're not going to be able to explain to the women.
Okay.
And so the women are going to get the wrong instructions and do the wrong stuff because the men didn't tell them right.
And because God didn't speak directly to the women,
Yeah.
God only spoke directly to Adam.
So what happened in Sinai? What's the big news from Sinai according to the Torah? What happened there?
10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments, but how was it just something that was written there by Aaron and the priest or Moses? What happened there?
God dictated the 10 Commandments to Moses.
So how do we call it when God speaks to all the people?
How do we call it?
It's called a revelation, right? That's at least what I studied in school. It's called, no, I'm serious. I mean, I'm not sure that's how you call it in American English, but I learned that it's called a revelation. So that's the big revelation. And Rabbi Tachlifa from Kesarin says, from Caesarea says, it's a different kind of revelation than what happened when God created the world. There was a revelation also during creation, and God revealed itself and spoke to whom?
Adam.
Only to Adam. So the world of the Garden of Eden is a world like that. And actually, it's a world that we know till today. in many Jewish circles and in many religious circles. It's a world where men hear the word of God and they transmit it into the women and they tell the women what to do, right? That's the traditional Jewish patriarchal world where God speaks to the men, God speaks to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, by the way, also to Rebecca, one time to Sarah, but mainly to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God speaks to Moses, not many times to Miriam, definitely not to Moses' wife, whoever she was, if it's the first or the second or the third. I'm not sure how many wives did he have, but it's a patriarchal world where God speaks to the men and the men are supposed to tell the women. Now, according to Rabbi Tachlifa of Keisarin, that's the big thing of Sinai. And it's a very radical reading. He says, everyone was there. And that's in the Torah that everyone was there. And then he says, in the Torah, if you compare it to the Garden of Eden, we know that God only spoke to Adam and only said to Adam, you shouldn't eat from the tree. And what happened? Adam said it to Eve, and did it work? No, actually, by the way, the accusation here of Eve is not said in the Torah, but it's a very strong accusation. She corrupted the world. So in a way, by the way, who changes the revelation? Is it the society that changes the revelation, or is it God that changes the way things are going to be revealed? According to this, not according to the Torah.
Well, the rabbi changed it. This rabbi would change it.
Yeah, but according to him, he doesn't say that he changed it. According to him, who decided to change the way that did the men come to an understanding?
God decided.
God decided. Yeah. So the change is within God. So the radical here that is that Rabbi Tachlifa of Caesarea says, when God created the world, God was not aware of, until the end, of how society is going to work. God didn't understand that if God will only speak to men, they will not be able to transmit it into the women in a way that would actually work. So God learned a lesson, and God changed the way God reveals itself. And the lesson is that if you don't tell the women, either first or together with everyone, it's not going to work. By the way, this thing speaks about women power. This is a very radical assumption. Women have the power to corrupt the world if you don't include them in the direction that the world is going. And women have the power to fix the world if they are included. So actually, Sinai is a move from a patriarchal world where only men are exposed to the direct word of God and they pass it into women, into a world where everybody listens equally. It's an egalitarian revelation. By the way, the beauty of this understanding is that it's actually fitting what you read in the Torah. The Torah is telling us time and again that everyone was there in Sinai, that no one was excluded from Sinai, so Sinai actually opens the revelation to everyone. Are we okay?
Yep.
Do you have the stamina for another text?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna go into our last text, also a pretty radical text, one of my favorites. We're going to read it paragraph by paragraph. We're going to take our time during the coming 15 minutes that we have to deal with it. And let's see what this says to us about the Torah that we received in Sinai. What Torah are we getting? What are we actually celebrating in the holiday of Shavuot? Brad, do you have the stamina to read the first part?
I'll give it a shot.
Please. You have some names there, but they're not very complicated. I gave Susan the hard names. You have pretty easy names. Please.
All right. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns, mounds upon mounds of halachot. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah.
Okay, so let's stop there. Benji, do you have a picture of Torah here that you can show, like any kind or any piece in the Torah scroll? From anything, if you have, we'll see. So you all remember that there's a big question when it comes to the receiving and giving of the Torah. How long was Moses there up on Mount Sinai?
Long time.
40 days and 40 nights, and Kylie said it best, a long time, because we all know that the number 40 in a Jewish tradition means a long time, okay? 40 years in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights twice on top of Mount Sinai, 40 days of flood. Moses was 40 when he ran away from Egypt, 40 when he took us out of Sinai, 40 when he reached 120. So 40 means a lot, doesn't really mean 40 per se. So he was there a long time. We also know that that did not work well for the people of Israel. They got fed up of waiting and they started doing the golden calf in order to replace Moses. So a lot of people are asking, thank you, Benji, what was Moses doing there for so long? And there's at least 600,000 answers. What was Moses doing up on Mount Sinai? None of them is saying, well, God was really taking the time with the 2 tablets of covenant, so it took God 40 days and 40 nights to create those 2 tablets. That's not one of the answers. God created the entire world in 6 days. God rested on the 7th. It shouldn't take God 40 days and 40 nights to create 2 tablets with 10 statements on them. We don't buy that. So this Midrash is saying the following. Do you see all the crowns that are there? Do you see that when there's an ayin or a shin or a nun, even on a gimel I see, or on a zayin, there's crowns? So God is saying to Moses, I need time to do all those crowns. Give me my time with calligraphy, because one day Rabbi Akiva will come, and from every crown he will derive mountains of laws. He will take the crown and interpret it to mountains and mountains of laws. So let's see, can we go back to the text? Let's see what happens next. Anybody wants to give a shot for, we have only 2 more parts, so anybody wants to be the reader of the next shot before I pick someone? Carol, do you want to read?
Carol, me?
Yes.
Yes. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, His students said to him, "My teacher, from where do you derive this?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "It is halakha transmitted to Moses from Sinai." When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive.
Okay, we're actually going to end in this part. We're not going to read the problematic part that comes after that. And I just want to say before we open it to discussion, and I do want to explain a few things there. You know, only the words that are in bold are actually in the Hebrew. Everything that is not bolded, that means that the translator thought that we are not smart enough to get it without additions. So the original text is just the bold stuff. So what happens here in the Hebrew, by the way, it's just 2 lines. It's not, we have 8 lines here in the English because of all those addition. So Moses says, there is going to be this Rabbi Akiva. I want to see Rabbi Akiva. So God takes him on, how are those movies? There are a lot of movies.
Time travel
or into the future or things like that. So by the way, that's a very long travel into the future. If Moses was, give or take, 1300 BCE, Rabbi Akiva, we actually know exactly when he lived. He lived during the time of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. That's, give or take, the middle of the 2nd century CE. So my math is not that good, but that's about 1500 years in a time tunnel to go. And he goes to the house of learning, and obviously he's out of place there. Okay. Now we know it from 2 things. One, it says here that he didn't understand anything. He wasn't able to follow. But there's also something that you need to know about the house of learning. We're all here on the same flat screen, right? No one is near, no one is close. We're all flat. We're not on a, I think it's not a 3D screen, okay? We're not on a 3D dimension. Having said that, in the Bet Midrash, it was not like that. In the house of learning, at those time in the Bet Midrash, the closest you are to the teacher, that means the better student you are. So the students that really knew a lot actually didn't even sit on a chair. They were sitting on the floor beneath the teacher. The first row are the 2nd best students. The 2nd row was the less best student, and so on. 7th and 8th row were left for the simple people that the Talmud is calling the ignoramus, the people who knew anything. Moses comes into the house of study of Torah, and he is seated. This is Moses Rabbeinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, the greatest leader we ever had. He's seated, with all due respect, on the 8th row, together with the people that don't know anything. And surprise, surprise, that's the fitting place for Moses. He doesn't understand anything. So much that it says his mind was, where does it say? His strength waned in English. My English is not that good. In the Hebrew, it says tashash kocho, okay, which is probably a good translation. His strength waned. Shlomo Naeh, my teacher of Talmud at Hebrew University, actually wrote a huge study on this term, his strength waned, or tashash kocho. That actually means you're almost on life support. You need the ICU. You're on the rank of death. This is the moment before totally being out of there. And then what happens? One student is asking Rabbi Akiva, with all due respect, teacher, where are you getting this law from? Where are you getting this teaching from? Now, that's another thing about study Torah. If you ask a rabbi, especially in a Talmudic setting, where did you get this law from? Where did you get this teaching? If the rabbi is standing on strong grounds, the rabbi will quote from the Torah. And best from Deuteronomy or Leviticus, Numbers, Exodus, okay. Genesis, there's only 2 or 3 laws in Genesis, so not that great, but still in the Torah, you're on good grounds. Then, if you don't have anything from the Torah, the prophets, and unlike what you were told, there are greater prophets and there are lesser prophets. If you quote from Malachi or if you quote from Ovadia, you're not standing on high ground. Jeremiah, Micah, Amos, Isaiah is the best. Those are better grounds. If you get to the writings, if you quote from Job or Ecclesiastic, you're not in a good place. If you're quoting from the Song of Songs, you really are in trouble. Rabbi Akiva has nothing. He doesn't have a quote. So what does he say? He says, Torah leMoshe miSinai. This is a Torah that was transmitted to Moses and Sinai. What does that mean? Benji said it earlier. What does that mean, Benji? Oral Torah. Moses heard it from God. God whispered to Moses. Moses whispered it to Joshua, who whispered it to the elders, and it goes from generation to generation. Now, if that was really literally so, would Moses not understand what's going on? Susan has answered. She didn't vocalize it, but Susan Allen has, in her face, is giving it. Of course that Moses would feel it is. The fact that he doesn't feel it is means that actually Moses never heard it. And now we go to what Carol Raskin, I think, said to us earlier. No, Holly said it. That means that the Torah that was received, if it's the oral Torah, and if we go by this midrash, that is also the Torah that we still teach today. That's the Torah that we derive from the text. That means that in Sinai, we didn't only get the 2 tablets of covenant, we also got the permission to feel ownership on the Torah and for the Torah to be an evolving thing till today. I finished my spiel, so it's time for questions, complaints, additions, more Torah. Everyone is unmuted, so if you have to say something, just mute yourself. Everybody wants to go and eat cheesecake, I understand.
We're all tired.
Yeah.
I can tell you I'm more of a blinches person than a cheesecake person, but I wouldn't mind cheesecake either. Chag Sameach, happy Shavuot, everyone.
Chag Sameach, Rabbi.
Chag
We're going to have services tomorrow morning and tomorrow night, and Torah study Saturday morning, and then services. And thank you very much, Asaf, for today.
Yes.
And we have a comedian on Saturday.
Oh, yeah, Baranka.
Yes.
Don't forget the comedy. If you don't have the Zoom link, just email me and I'll send you the
Real good.
What did you say? I'm not going to say that. Benji was being, well, never mind. Just that you know that 2 hours ago, the Zoom room was not working and Benji somehow did a hocus pocus and we were able to do that.
He's a rock star.
Yes, he's a rock star. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon. Chag Sameach.
Everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, thank you.